Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Thane Lawrie is an author and a retired CEO. He's also a Buddhist, which provided the inspiration for his book, The Buddhist CEO. Thane and I explore some of the precepts of Buddhism. We talk about the value of presence, about compassion, and about finding what the Buddhists call the middle way, and so much more. Join us for a fascinating conversation. Thane, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us the story behind your book, The Buddhist CEO.
Hi, Pat. Thanks for having me on. I'll give you a quick rundown of the story behind The Buddhist CEO. I'd always had a dream to write a book, and I'd thought about many things I could write the book upon. Till eventually one day I thought, well, maybe basing a book loosely on my own life would actually be the most interesting. And I had worked as a CEO myself for about 7 years in my native Scotland. I was fairly successful at it. And I also happened to be a practicing Buddhist and had been for about 23 years. But the pressures of the job got to me, and eventually I had to give it up due to ill health. And I'd used Buddhism throughout that time to try and balance my life, and maybe unsuccessfully in the end of the day. But I've been on a journey of recovery sort of ever since, and I've recovered quite well. And Buddhism's been a big part in that recovery as well. And I just thought, how many people find themselves in the same situation where they find themselves in a very stressful job or a very difficult job, and maybe a job that they also like and enjoy, but how they try to balance it with their own inner beliefs. In my case, it was Buddhism, but it could be any religion. Or it could actually just be a spiritual practice. Or hopefully it would appeal to somebody who's just a moral person, maybe be an atheist. That balance between being a modern person and wanting to follow a different way of life. And that's what I found quite difficult at times. It also helped me, but I found it difficult to balance as well. But I thought, well, that'd be something interesting to write about. So that's where the idea was born for my novel, The Buddhist CEO.
Yeah, the Buddhists say find the middle way, but for me, to even attempt to find the middle way has always been one of extremes. I experience one extreme, I experience the other. Hopefully that leads me to the middle.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the idea of balance is a really important one for all of us, no matter what we do. One of the things I loved many things about your book, but one of the things you pointed out, you're talking about stress, that the constant pressure and striving, you wrote, to achieve status over time wears us down, and we experience life as suffering.
Yeah.
Do we have to?
Interesting question. Certainly, essentially, the Buddha, the actual historical Buddha, said that life was often characterized by suffering. And by that, I don't think he always meant great suffering, although people do experience great suffering, so terrible things like illness and things that you've probably talked about lots in your podcast. But I think he was talking primarily around just everyday dissatisfaction. In fact, the word he used was dukkha, a Sanskrit word, which apparently isn't very easily translated into English. But I think the kind of things he was talking about, I think, were, if only I had a little bit more money, I'd be happier. If only my kids hadn't got up last night, I'd be happier today. My work would be fine if only I didn't work with that one person. If only I didn't get married quite so young, or if only I didn't wait till a little bit later. So I think that kind of mild dissatisfaction was what he pointed at. And I think we all feel that to some degree, even if you're a practicing Buddhist or a meditator or not. But I think the Buddha said, the way to try and get around that is to try and live, and I suppose this is what I try to say in the book, is to try and live in the now. It's kind of, some people might say that's what Buddha discovered, living in the now. Now, people listening might think, well, what is that? And I think this dissatisfaction or the suffering comes from not living in the now. If we actually analyze our minds at any given time, chances are we're in the past or we're in the future. So I can't wait to get home from work. I wish somebody didn't say that earlier in the meeting. So very rarely are we actually fully present to our lives. That's what the Buddhists encourage us to do. So I'm having a conversation with you just now. Am I fully engaging in the conversation with you? Fully giving myself to you, to this conversation? When I cook my food, am I fully giving myself to cooking my food? When I'm, eating my food, am I fully giving myself to eating my food? Whereas quite often we're actually, even when we're eating our food, preparing our food, or speaking to a friend, our minds are often somewhere else. I think this is what Buddhism points to, that there is actually a way of getting beneath that suffering. And it's some of these factors in life, difficulties, can't be avoided, but our relationship to it, I think, can be changed, where it can be, simple tasks can become joyful. I think, mundane chores and tasks, are fully present to them, can actually become, I've found in my own life that even just cleaning and making food and doing simple things can become joyful. And I think if we're here in the moment now, even when we face bumps in the road, like I did personally, my main character it does personally, I think you can still experience those joys within those difficult moments if you're here in the now, rather than letting yourself race ahead to what's happening next, or what the disaster is going to befall us, or how difficult things are. So I think there is a way of sort of relating to suffering in a different way.
I think learning to be present is one of the fundamental things we need to learn. I don't know, have you ever read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now?
I haven't, but I have read some of his books. I'm aware of the book you mean, so I've got a fair idea of what will be within it.
Yeah, I have found, for me personally, being present requires focus and effort. It doesn't magically happen. But when you can be truly present, it's as if time extends or it's meaningless. And I see that moment as an opportunity for such creativity, because it's in that moment that you're creating your future. And in the next, and in the next. And I think that by learning to be present, our lives become so much richer. Not having our thoughts race ahead is just key. And I think that also goes to one of the things you talk about in your book is acceptance. Acceptance of what is, acceptance of the moment. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, acceptance, I think, is a big concept in Buddhism. And I think I found it very helpful in my own life. Often we can wish reality to be something else, and I think acceptance is actually accepting what is here and now in front of us. So we just talked about suffering, and often that low level suffering that we often experience in life, wishing something was slightly different from what it was. And if only that difference was here, life would be okay. That, to me, that's not accepting where you actually are. And I think accepting, certainly in a sort of Buddhist sort of outlook, is actually accepting. So in my life, my bump in the road was I became ill when I was doing the CEO job after 7 years, developed a neurological condition that's known as functional neurological disorder, or FND. I suppose I could have wished that away, but I had to accept where I was. And that's maybe an extreme example of illness, but it can be little things. I'm in a job that I don't greatly like. You have to accept that. Or you have to accept where you are in life. That doesn't mean to say you have to put up with it, but you have to accept the reality of where you are before you can decide to move on. So in my case, of my illness, I think I very much had to accept a lot of things that initially were quite difficult. But one was allowing other people to help me, for example. Dawned to me then that I'd actually helped other people all my life. I never really thought how the person being helped felt. Because it felt a bit strange to me to start allowing people to help me. I was always somebody that sort of helped myself. But then once I kind of let go of that and allowed people to help me and accepted that situation, it was actually quite nice. So I think that's something about accepting where you are, accepting the reality of your situation, one that allows a bit of peace to come to wherever you are in life. Or if you're accepting a situation that's difficult and you want to change it, you have to actually fully realize it first before you can move on and make changes, I think.
Why do we avoid recognizing these events, the reality around us? Why do we avoid it?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. There could be a lot of reasons for it. I sometimes wonder, and I think we talked about this earlier on before we started recording, but in modern life, I think it's almost set up in a way where there's always something to enjoy. There's always something coming next. So if go to the movies tonight, or we buy this latest thing, things will be okay. There's always a way of overcoming it. And I think that maybe encourages people to avoid reality, possibly. Maybe our modern society is set up in that way. I mean, I've written a lot about in the book about the monastery and the peace I got from going there. But on the face of it, there's nothing exciting about it. In fact, I just posted a blog post today about this. I was in the monastery last week for a week, and I posted a blog post 20 minutes before coming on here. But on the face of it, somebody might think, why on earth do you go to the monastery? You get up at 5:45 in the morning, lights are out at 10 o'clock. You meditate, you're given jobs to do. I was cleaning toilets and I was also working in the kitchen. But I find it very joyful because it's all done virtually in silence, a lot of silence. Everything's done mindfully. But it's the total antithesis of the modern world, noise, news. I'm not saying these things are bad per se, but when we're exposed to it all the time, I think it encourages us to avoid being in the now. And there's very little in the modern world that actually encourages to be in the now. Yes, there's writers like Eckhart Tolle, and I suppose myself and others, but maybe the mainstream culture, not many people are hearing that. And I think yes, a lot of society is encouraging us to not look inward, not be present. It's always to look to the next thing, look forward to the next holiday, look forward to the next thing that's coming along. As I say, some of these things are okay. I go on holiday as well, but there's very little in the mainstream culture, I find, saying, just live now, just be present to your life. That's where happiness is.
Yeah, I think happiness and joy is definitely in the now. It's interesting. I think that until you can experience that kind of silence in your mind, you don't realize how busy your mind really is. And I think most of the world is working, their minds are just very busy. They don't know anything else. And until they can discover peace and silence and the profound depth of silence, they can't see how busy and distracted they are. How do you move somebody? How do you allow somebody to experience that sort of mental spiritual peace?
Yeah, it's certainly difficult. I mean, minds think. It's often just seen as another organ in Buddhism, just the mind that they think. That's what they do. And I think some people get frustrated when they first come to silence. Certainly, meditation. I run a meditation class locally on a Thursday night, and I'll be there later tonight actually. But I think people try and force their thoughts out and become frustrated quite quickly because minds think, thoughts come back. So I think it's being compassionate with yourself. And by that I mean, if you sit in meditation, within about, unless you're very, very good, but even monks would say the same, a lot of monks I've met would say the same, your mind starts thinking and you realize you're not meditating. But the idea is you bring yourself back to the meditation and you start again. A few minutes later, you're thinking again, you bring yourself back to the meditation because minds think. And there's something about this gentle process of just bringing yourself back, not getting frustrated with yourself, that allows this to sort of the hold of the mind to sort of loosen. You may be thinking, but you can get underneath it. You can just feel peaceful. And I think if you meditate over time, whether you're a Buddhist or not, it doesn't really matter. I think that constant letting thoughts come, noticing them, coming back to your meditation, starts to play out in life. So when you're driving the car and you get annoyed, a little bit like the thoughts of meditation, you just bring yourself back. Somebody annoys you in the workplace, or you hit a bump in the road, your health, instead of getting too concerned about it, you're thinking about it, you bring yourself back to your life. I think this is how it works. I think this compassionate relationship to ourselves. And I think that is a big key. I think I say that in the book, that even compassionate people, I think that's most of us, find it easier to be compassionate to other people than we are to ourselves. And I think that's something that's often forgotten.
And I would argue that until we learn to be compassionate to ourselves, we can't truly be compassionate to others.
I wouldn't fall out with that. Yeah, I wouldn't fall out with that. I think it's a huge lesson. And I think it's a huge, I mean, I've seen it in myself at times. And I think when I became ill, maybe I recognized that I'd always been, it was easy to help other people, but not always so easy to help myself, if I'm being honest. And something it's grown as a realization, partly from becoming ill myself. But yeah, I think we've got to start with being compassionate to ourselves. And some people might see that as selfish, but I don't think it is, because I agree with your statement that I think we've got to be comfortable in our own skins, happy with ourselves, accepting of our lives, before we can start to really truly help others.
Yeah, I think we're all very judgmental of ourselves, and when we can start to learn to try to let go of that judgment, it means hopefully that we'll be less judgmental of others as well, and more understanding and more compassionate. But I think the judgment one is really hard. We live in a hierarchical world, a very material world in most cases, and it just lends itself towards judging everything. Um, Talk a little bit about the role of judgment in Buddhism.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Judgment. I think that's a really, really big question for society just now. Okay, I'm in Scotland, part of the United Kingdom, and you're in America, with a similar sort of, you mentioned the middle road, similar sort of tensions, I think, in the world that are seem to be, to me, be getting more polarized and more extreme in both of our countries, and in other countries as well, particularly in the Western world. People see themselves as left wing or right wing, or taking a certain view. And there seems to be a real calling out now for the middle road. And I've heard even friends say things, or they're right wing, or they're left wing, in a derogatory way, as if to say it's not okay. But I think we really need to try and get away from that now and say, well, actually, we live in a democracy. People are allowed to be left wing or right wing or in the middle. We need to find common ground between these things, and judging people, they are wrong and we are right, or vice versa. I think that's very dangerous the more and more we get into. We need to find a way to say, well, I actually believe this, you believe that, but find a way of sort of working with that together, I think. And in terms of judgment from a Buddhist perspective, Buddhism, I suppose it has a practice. So we're asked, generally, all Buddhist schools generally encourage people to meditate regularly, because it has this every day at least. You're not forced to do that, it's just recommended that this daily practice builds up over time, helps you to let go of those thoughts and find a more peaceful life. And there's mindfulness, bringing that meditative mind, sort of what we're doing, being fully present to, as we've talked about already, cooking our food or talking to each other or doing what we're doing. But generally, they all have Buddhist precepts, which I suppose are they're kind of, I wouldn't say rules. They're not really rigid rules, but things we can live our life by. So, and all Buddhist schools have agree upon the first five. Zen Buddhism is what I sort of follow it as 10, but all of the first five. But certainly, on all Buddhist schools, judging other people and is seen as being something to be very careful of. Because you can fall into things we've discussed about getting into, we are right, they are wrong, sort of thing. So Buddhism definitely asks us to be very careful of judging others. At the same time, it also, I don't think, says we have to be a doormat for MD. We could stick up for what's right and be against what's wrong. Just to be careful of falling into that. I see this in the world too much now. Just I'm right, they're wrong, sort of thing. And probably in my own life, if I was being completely honest, we can all fall into that at times. But I think practicing mindfulness and meditation helps us to at least try and see that and avoid it as best we can. But there's a real need, I think, in the modern world for trying to find the middle ground just now.
You mentioned 5 rules that most people agree upon in Buddhism. What are they?
Okay, the 5, we're talking about them as precepts. So in Soto Zen, there's 10 precepts, but most agree upon the first 5. So now you put one of the spots off the top of my head. The way I would phrase it might be slightly different, but to refrain from killing, refrain from stealing, refrain from sexual misconduct, refrain from saying that which is untrue, and refrain from indulging intoxicants. So that's the 5 that I think all Buddhist schools would agree upon. And in Zen, there's another 5, which are refrain from speaking against others, refrain from being proud of yourself and devaluing others, refrain from being mean with either dharma, which is the Buddhist teachings, or wealth, refrain from indulging anger, and refrain from defaming what we call the 3 treasures of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the Buddhist community, Buddhist teaching, the historic Buddha. So, yeah, so I think those, certainly the first 5, probably them all, are probably universally, maybe across religions, and maybe just good people would say that's fairly good. Most people wouldn't fall out with them all. Maybe the first one, refrain from killing. A lot of Buddhists might see that as interpret that as being vegetarian, although it's not necessarily imposed upon you. Many Tibetan monks, for example, just from the nature of Tibet being sort of 16,000 feet up in the air, there's not many vegetables grow there. So historically, a lot of them have eaten meat just for practical reasons. So there are sort of caveats to that as well, But, yeah, just a practical sort of reminder of what would be a good way to live,
It's a peaceful way to live, which I think is appealing to almost everybody.
Yeah.
I want to go back to what you were we were talking about judgment, and one of the things we were looking at is how we tend to look outside of ourselves and judging in the hierarchies and materialism and all that. That kind of goes to I'm sorry, I'm wandering a little bit here, but I'm thinking about a few threads of our conversation. One of which was that we've become so polarized. People believe this, they believe that, and there's not much in between. I think that people often identify with a position or identify with a group or a crowd. And to change that identity is just incredibly beyond upsetting. I mean, it's so difficult for them. What is identity in the Buddhist world, and what are some of the things we need to look for as we form our own identities in this so-called real world?
Yeah. From a Buddhist perspective, the self, this idea of our own self, is actually seen as being illusory, like an illusion. Although on one hand, we recognize it exists, but we see it's very fragile, changing. So, there's Thane, who used to be a CEO, there's Thane now, who is now an author. But that changes quite. Thane who was well, Thane who was unwell, Thane who's getting better. It can change. It can change very quickly, and it can be hard to grasp. Am I the same person who I was 10 years ago and 10 years before that? I look different. My hair's white now. It's really changing. But Buddhism sort of suggests that's it's kind of, I was going to use the word dangerous, but it's kind of not wise to get too hung up in that idea of yourself because it's so changing, you can never really grasp it. There's something deeper than that is most Buddhist schools would say is non-changing, is the bedrock in some ways of your life. So if we quieten our minds down, we experience that. There's different words used for that. But in Zen Buddhism, we often talk about Buddha nature, our true self, which is just something that's universally characterized as being peaceful, grounded, joyful. And that's below this idea of who we are. A lot of these are constructed in our minds, maybe from our upbringing, where we work, I'm right wing, I'm left wing, I'm a boss, I'm not a boss, sort of thing, Whereas if we can get below that, there's something that we all experience. It is actually more real than that. And the more we quieten our minds, the more we can experience that. Um, so I think the self, from a Buddhist perspective, is very flimsy and not as solid as we think it is.
Now, you wrote, perhaps this tension between the spiritual and worldly life has existed from the beginning. And I think it has. And I think that once you get introduced to the sense of peace and the experience of a monastery, oh my gosh, it's so tempting to just want to be in the monastery all the time.
Yes, yes. Well, that's kind of what my main character in the book sort of tries to deal with. He's finds the peace of the monastery. But once he's already married, happily married, I should say, and has 2 children, but he can't help but dream at times when he's sitting in his stressful workplace thinking, what are the monks doing now? I would love to just go and join them. I suppose he has to eventually accept his situation, that he's committed to the world and his family life. And he has to accept that, and he has to accept that there's still a way to find peace. And he visits the monastery as often as he can, and he finds a way forward with that. But he's definitely torn at times to, where he thinks about the monks and their peaceful life.
One of the things that you wrote that I find so intriguing is the monks have taught me to listen on 2 levels when a talk is given during a meditation period. One level is to understand through the mind and intellect. The second is to understand it through intuition and feeling. Wow. Our world is so governed by mind and intellect, but really it's intuition and feeling that has the power to move and transform us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly am an anti-intellectual in a way. I've been at university myself, and being a CEO, thinking was pretty good. Although intuition helped a lot then as well. But the more and more I go through life, I think your intellect gets you so far, and it's very useful. But certainly some of the old Buddhist scriptures and the people who wrote them, they certainly were clever people, the way they've written down the information. But there's a saying in Buddhism that the Buddhas can only point the way. So you've got to do it yourself to a degree. Reading things and speaking to people can help you, but there's something about intuition where you get a feeling for something. I couldn't quite explain it rationally. So I talked earlier on about the Buddha nature, sort of this more concrete thing that we all have in us. It's more real than our idea, our self, our personalities, and our who we think we are. It's quite hard to explain that in words. But I think somebody who's meditated for a long time, whether a Buddhist, a Christian, or even an atheist, actually will know what I'm talking about. We might disagree on how to describe it, but if we actually describe how we felt, I think we'd all describe something pretty similar. I've always been a great believer that people who really practice a tradition, whether it's a religion or a spiritual practice, it doesn't really matter what you practice. I don't see Buddhism as being better than any other one. I just see it as being what appealed to me the most. That you find people end up in the same place, I think, whatever they practice, as long as it's wholehearted and it's something positive, they end up being a bit more peaceful than they were before, hopefully a bit more happier in their skins and in their own skins, and just being a bit more comfortable in life. I think a lot of that comes from intuition. There's a bit of reading and a bit intellectualizing about things, but I just think just knowing yourself if something's healthy and wholesome and worth pursuing, it can't be always be explained with the mind.
No, I think some of the more interesting things are not explained with your mind, actually. And it's hard to put it into words. I tell this story a lot, so for my listeners, forgive me. But it was such a profound experience for me. I used to fly high performance sailplanes. And I'm flying one day, like 50-foot, 15-meter wingspans, winglets on the end. I'm flying over Lake Tahoe one day, which is this beautiful alpine lake, emerald waters, turquoise. I mean, it's just gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm up around 16, 17,000 feet. And I turn and I balance one of the winglets on a bubble of air. And that bubble of air rises through the sky with my plane balanced on it. It was just in this beautiful
Wow.
environment, sun streaming through the canopy. It was a moment of total oneness and connection. And it was a
Mm-hmm.
moment where time left me. It was
Mm-hmm.
eternal.
Mm.
And I think that these types of experiences, which have deep knowing in them, are only accessible through intuition and feeling.
Mm. Mm.
They're not, I can tell you that story, but it may not touch you or it may not change you because you have to be there.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that being there, again, it goes to being present and in the present moment. I think there's such a rich life to be had. And I fear that in our society where we're missing it. We are absolutely missing it. With our focus on the external, our focus with aligning with this side or that. And I wonder what do you think we can do to find that middle way?
I loved your story, by the way, and it did touch me. But you're probably too.
Thank
You
you.
probably you probably had to be there to really experience it as you did. Use an instant word there, the eternal. That's often used in Buddhism, the eternal, to describe this other thing that's not us. Just we can point. Just I mentioned that was interesting. You used that word. It's a question. You can look at the news in the evening, and it's possible to despair. I think whatever, certainly in the UK and certainly in the US, you can see a polarisation of left and right. Certainly in Scotland, there's people for Scottish independence, people against. Well, we had Brexit here, where we came out of the European Union, really split the United Kingdom in half. I mean, more people in Scotland wanted to stay in than come out, and in England, more people wanted to come out than stay in. And Northern Ireland was the same as Scotland, and Wales voted the other way, the same way as England. So, even within the four countries, the United Kingdom, there's all these tensions. I know that you've got similar tensions in America between sort of left and right and things. So, similar sort of challenges. Now, how do you challenge this? How do you challenge this? And the only real answer I can offer is you've got to begin with yourself. And for me, that is starting to be somebody who, I suppose, if I'm a Buddhist, I'm trying to meditate, and I suppose practice mindfulness and the things we've discussed already. It brings a certain joy and a happiness to my life. It doesn't make me a perfect being by any means at all. Maybe a better being than I would be if I didn't do these things, I believe. But hopefully it makes me a reasonable human being who can still get things wrong, but is trying to try and get on with my fellow people, whatever their views on Scottish independence or Brexit or left and right. So I think starting with ourselves has got to be the one of the answers. And I'm certainly not advocating everybody should become a Buddhist, but I think just people disagreeing somehow that not I am going to try and live a good life. I interpret that as meditating and being a Buddhist. Somebody else, it could be something different. As long as it's trying to just say, I'm going to try and make a positive contribution to the world. And if we find ourselves at loggerheads with other people, I would ask, well, you need to reflect upon that and say, well, am I trying to make a positive contribution? Um, there's nothing wrong with holding views on either side of these arguments, I don't think, because we're all human beings trying to rationalize our life and make our way through life as best we can. It's when we start aggressively sort of falling out with our people and believing we're fundamentally right and they're fundamentally wrong. I think that's when we've got to really question ourselves. So, I would encourage folk to try and live a peaceful life. For me, I think meditation is one of the answers, whatever religion or spiritual belief you come from. Just I'm not a great experienced player. I suppose there's other things like that could be quite similar to it. People are really engaging with their religion could also do it, but something that quietens your mind, something that helps you to relax, something that helps you to sort of, just be peaceful, find a peaceful way through things. I think that's, if everybody did that, the world would become a more peaceful place. Now, I'm not naive enough to say everybody will start doing that, but it seems like a pretty good place to start, I think.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.